Thank you everyone for having me. I hope that my presentation today isn't too left of field for you all and a little bit weird, I guess. I'm coming from a psychology background and clinical sort of background, and trying to apply that digital tech sort of feel to it. So really my mandate has sort of been, how can I apply that technology in order to help more people have access to interventions? So trying to blend the public health, I guess, field with technology, and basically, you know, improve mental health for as many young people as I can. And I'll tell you why as I go through. So I might sort of present some information that you might not really have thought would be what I would present, but I just sort of want to give you an idea for why I'm doing what I'm doing, really. And for me, that's actually just as important as thinking about what you're doing, because the end result is people will only use your tools if there's a reason for them to use your tools. And as we've seen over the last 20 years with digital tech, we've spent all this time and money developing tools for the health space, and there's just so many that sit there unused, and it's because we haven't spent enough time thinking about why we're building them, and should we be building them. So I think it's really important to sort of come back to some of those things. The background that you see on my screen is actually one of our libraries at USQ. So it's our Ipswich library space. So they've built it, try and make it nice and calm and peaceful for our students. It's a really lovely space, actually. If we're on that campus, we spend a lot of time in there. It's really nice. So it makes you feel a little bit peaceful, as you were saying. And yeah, it's a nice place to sort of be. Let me try and share my screen, and I've got 3 screens open, so sometimes that is always a challenge. Let me try and get this going and make sure it works. All right, are we seeing the slideshow? Perfect. Okay, yep. So interestingly, as I started putting together, I'm just going to move. I've lost you guys away from my camera, so I'm going to move you a bit closer so I'm not looking all over the shop. All right, as I started putting these slides together, I kind of realized how out of whack we have developed things, really, and how backwards some of our work has been because we started so early. And you'll see that as we sort of go through. And most importantly, what I'm going to talk to you about has been part of this massive team of people. So I'm sure I have missed many people on here, but there's a huge list of people that's been involved, and you'll see that Jamin has been part of that. And I will be talking about one particular project that he's sort of been part of as well. I'm really excited to sort of give you some examples of that. One of the programs that I'll talk about is Brave, which we have attempted to commercialize, which I'll talk about as well. There is a slight chance that in the future we may get, you know, royalties from that. Unlikely, but it's there as a potential conflict of interest. So I just wanted to make sure I acknowledge everybody. I'm not sure where everybody is meeting today virtually, but I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay respect to the elders past, present and emerging wherever everybody is sitting. Here at Springfield, where I am, there's many Indigenous groups, and across our campuses we have a strong Indigenous presence. And I'm sure that's the same for wherever you are as well. What I wanted to cover today is I wanted to give you a bit of a background as to the timing of my digital journey, because it's actually really important, because it started back in 2001, which is a very, very different landscape from what you're looking at right now. And then I wanted to give you a little bit of a context about children and technology, because that's also a very unique kind of landscape that has shaped the way that I have worked. And for me, when you're building digital tools, it comes down to these, and looking at how you make use of digital tools, it comes down to these 3 Ds. So design, development, and dissemination. And so I wanted to spend my time talking about these three components. and doing so by taking you through 3 examples, 3 tools that I have developed and worked on over time. So one of those is called Coping Coach, one of those is a Brave program, and one of those is the Interactive Child Distress Screener. And so I'll sort of take you through each of those. I'm actually not going to take you in the order that I've got them on the screen there. As I was developing these, I sort of realized actually I'm going to flip those around a little bit. And in reality, in each of those 3 examples, I'll talk you through each of those 3 sort of components. And as we go, we'll have a little bit of a talk about the role of emerging technologies, which for me was all sorts of things, and for you will be VR and AR and all sorts of different types of things. So that's what I wanted to cover today. Okay, you might be looking at this going, what on earth is that floppy disk down in the bottom corner? Well, it's a floppy disk. When I started in 2001, we were still using floppy disks. We hadn't even really gotten onto the CDs. Like it was back then, we had big monstrosities of computers. It was crazy what we were using still at the time. I tried to go back and get some examples of the very first versions of some of the programs that we built, which I developed myself using Dreamweaver. That's a whole other story that we'll get to later on. I couldn't even find the presentations because they're back stored on a floppy disk somewhere, which I can no longer access because I don't have a computer to read those anymore. So, you know, we started way back when. There's been so many changes. I tried to put together a timeline of all the different changes in technology, hardware and software in that time, but that was near impossible, so I gave up. And, you know, the sorts of core decisions that we were looking at the time was, hey, do we build a program that's internet-based or CD-ROM? So that was the core decision that we had to make when we first built. We chose internet rather than CD-ROM. We were shunned because we were told, hey, that's way too risky. Everyone else was going CD-ROM. Thank God we did, because CD-ROM quickly went out of fashion. But realistically, we were way ahead of the time, which was good in a way, but also quite, we had a lot of disadvantages because it was very tricky for people to accept what we were doing and for things to be taken up. And, you know, there was a lot of challenges as we went. So I guess if you're in the same situation now where you've got these new emerging technologies, being right at the forefront is exciting, but also can be quite challenging to sort of get ahead of the game and sort of, you know, be that first person. There are positives and there are negatives. So it's sort of things to keep in mind as you go in terms of being that first one who will be able to disseminate. Yeah, it can be challenging to get people to convince people to sort of take it up and things. So let's keep some of these things in mind as we go, but the same sort of problems will apply and positives will apply as you go now as well. So I just wanted to give you a bit of a background as to why I do what I do. And I think whatever you are building with your technology, you need to have the same rationale. You need to have the same reason, and then there needs to be some sort of underlying driver for why you're building something. It might be something completely different. There might be an economic reason why you're building what you're building. But for me, I was always wanting to build tools that would ultimately improve children's mental health. And the reason that I wanted to do that were some of these statistics that are on the screen now. So we know that for adult mental illness, which we know has such a huge impact in people's lives, 50% of all adult mental illness starts before the age of 14, right? So if we can get in and treat mental illness and you know, try and get problems under control in childhood, then we can already prevent 50% of adult mental illness. We know that 13% of 4 to 11-year-olds experience mental illness. 1 in 10 12 to 17-year-olds self-harm. So when I look at these stats and I think of my 9-year-old and I think, oh, if I can get her through to adulthood without experiencing these problems, then I've done my job. And so for me, I want my child and as many children out there to be able to get through to adulthood without suffering from mental illness. And so that becomes my mission. Anxiety and depression are amongst those most common problems. When you ask young people what they think about mental health, their top concerns are listed there: stress, school problems, and mental health as well, just generally. When you ask them where they want to seek help, 50% would go to the internet. Nearly a third had used the internet to source information about specific issues. Okay, they seek support from their peers as well. They might seek sort of information as well, but they're curious and they're seeking information from the internet. Only 50% or 56% of young people who have a mental disorder have actually sought help in the past 12 months. When I started my PhD, which was back in 2001, that figure was 25%. And so for me, I was shocked, and I thought, how can we only have a quarter of young people with a disorder who are seeking help? And that's why I wanted to come in and look at ways to make these interventions more available to young people, which is why I chose the internet as a pathway. Even when they do seek help, only 2% receive specialist help. What that means is that they're receiving help from a psychologist or a child psychologist or somebody who knows the right treatment for that disorder. Okay, so even when they do get help, they're not getting help from the right person. So this is why I'm trying to use digital technologies to get the right treatment to the right person. Government now recommends these sorts of approaches, digital and low intensity services to young people as a way to get access to care in a timely manner. And the evidence base is growing internationally. We have 20 years of evidence now that shows that these sorts of interventions work and that they're almost as effective, if not as effective, when they're delivered with minimal therapist assistance as face-to-face therapy. So we've got this really great case for using the internet to deliver interventions, particularly cognitive behaviour therapy, to young people. There are now, if you went and did a Google search for online interventions for young people, particularly cognitive behaviour therapy, for anxiety, depression, you'll come up with all these sorts of programs. So young people can find a lot of help online. They might not know how to find it properly, but there's a lot out there. So this is really great, it's really promising, really helpful. This isn't even counting the apps that are out there, okay? So apps are a whole other story. There's loads of those. Some of those are not so helpful, but there's also loads of those. The problem with it is they're out there, kids like them, teens like them, they're acceptable, but they're not actually used. Okay, so a lot of these interventions are not actually used and they're not taken up by the population more broadly. And this is something that we as clinicians and we as researchers and we as designers need to really think about very carefully, because we spend all these years looking at building interventions and platforms and tools. And in the end, they just sit there. And so we really need to think carefully about why they don't translate into practice and why they don't get used by the people that we want them to be used by. What we know from a research and a translation point of view is that it often takes about 17 years for tools that have been researched and evidence-based to translate into clinical practice. That's too long. Okay, we need to think about speeding that up. In the case of digital tools, the tech becomes outdated really quickly. So that traditional sort of idea of validating a tool or an intervention or whatever it might be in the lab and then slowly working towards delivering that in the real world setting is not going to work with these tech-based tools. So we need to think about other ways of doing that. But if we go straight to the real world and straight to sort of just developing a tool and offering it to people in the real world, that's really difficult, because balancing what people need for their health and their mental health and what people want is actually super tricky. And when people think they know what they want as opposed to what they actually need, they often clash, unless you are doing it in a setting with a healthcare provider. So the idea of matching a tool to a user's needs and wants becomes even more challenging, particularly when you are doing it in that open context. And so this is why apps have often failed, because designers will often design what they think is needed or design what a user tells them that they want, but it often doesn't match the targets of what's needed for a particular health need or based on an evidence-based intervention. But it gets out there really super quickly, so it avoids that first pitfall. So we can often target one of these pitfalls, but not the other. So it becomes a really tricky need that we can often meet the needs of what people think they want and what they think they need, but not actually the evidence. So really, really tricky set of circumstances with digital tools, particularly in children. And so what we really need to work towards is understanding really clearly what your consumer needs and what your end user needs. And they're not always the same person. The consumer and the end user is not always the same person, and that's particularly the case for young people. So when it comes to children and why they might be different, they're not just little adults. They come with a whole bunch of other people. They always come with a parent, and the parents always have their own set of opinions and needs and wants. They often come with siblings. They often come with teachers who have their competing demands and things as well. So, you know, the end user might be the child, but the consumer might be the parent. And so you've got to balance both sets of needs there. Children have vast developmental, cognitive and verbal variation. So a 5-year-old is incredibly different to a 10-year-old. And so how do you balance those needs as well? A 12-year-old is very different to a 15-year-old. So we've got to be able to use our co-design and you know, variations there to sort of tap into that. And children are very much needing a lot more focus on how you add different design strategies or different support strategies to counteract that lack of human contact. So an adult, if you design something for an adult in a digital tool, they are much more able to cope with that lack of human support, and they can implement their own strategies for managing the idea that there's not somebody there to help them. So if they stumble across a problem in a digital tool, whether it's a question that they have, or they think, well, how am I going to implement that? They can problem solve that a lot easier. A child cannot, and so you need to implement different strategies to sort of overcome that. And co-design takes on a different meaning. So when you sit down and do co-design with an older person or a teenager or an adult, you really can go in with a lot more sort of assumptions and thinking that they understand what you mean. But children, you have to set a lot more parameters around your co-design, because otherwise it can take on a very different meaning. And children may not understand things in the same way as older people. And pretty soon you can find yourself down one rabbit hole and end up with a whole bunch of data that actually doesn't help you in any way. And we'll go through some examples. So some of the ways that you can sort of understand your group and try and get to a point where you really know that your tool is going to be used by them is to try and understand their attitudes and try and understand what it is that how they would use the tools that you're building. And we've done some of that research where we've looked at their attitudes towards how they would log into therapy and such, because, you know, we wanted to understand how young people would use our online platform. So we did this a little bit later on. So when we were converting, and I'll come back to some of those examples later and you'll start to see it all pieced together. When we were converting our online program into an open access platform, which everybody could use, we needed to really think about, okay, we need young people to seek this platform out. So let's think about how they would actually use this. We also needed to understand how parents would use it and how mental health workers would use it, because parents are often the gatekeepers, and then teenagers would often use the platform independently. So we did a series of survey studies to understand how they would use it, their attitudes towards therapies, and what they thought would be the problems. We went into these studies thinking, hey, teens are going to love this. Teens are going to want to seek it out. Parents might be a bit iffy, and the clinicians, they'll probably feel okay about it. We were so wrong. None of them had used computer-based therapy before. This is about 2015, not so surprising. Really not a lot of experience with it. Surprisingly, the teens perceived a lot more problems than the parents. So we were thinking that the teens would be really open to this and they'd be feeling really positively about it. In fact, they perceived a lot more problems. They thought, no, we're going to drop out. You know, we're really worried that you won't be able to explain things clearly enough. We're worried about the privacy and security of the information. Teens, who thought teens would be worried about that? We're worried about the fact that you won't have a therapist with us, that you won't be able to tailor it to our needs. Parents, not so much, which we thought was pretty funny. And then the clinicians were worried about these things as well. They were worried about dropouts, materials being pitched at the right level, computer confidence, literacy, technical issues. So straight away we knew we had to start addressing some of these things in the way that we built the platform. When we looked at the benefits, the parents could see more benefits. Okay, it was all about the practicality for them. You know, that you could use it any time, you could avoid the wait list, really affordable, accessible. The teens could see some benefits, not as high as the parents. But what was really interesting here is this more engaging one. We always went in thinking teens, young people are going to love this because, you know, they'll want to come and do it online because it'll be more engaging for them than coming in face to face. They can do it like they do a game at home and this is how they'll want to do therapy. No, they don't want that. They actually find it more engaging to do the sort of the discussion with the therapist. And I can tell you we're sort of doing some of these questions now with people during COVID, and that theme is becoming even more strong now. So this idea that mix of gaming and therapy or gaming and mental health actually is not what teens want at all. So that really sort of was surprising to us. Although as you'll see from some of the results, it makes sense then with our earlier design, co-design sort of issues. So, you know, it kind of made us think a little bit more. Clinicians could see a lot of benefits, which was really helpful. When we asked them, would they intend to use the platform and would they intend to use the computerized program? Parents, yes, definitely. Teens, less likely. So again, we're sort of starting to think here, okay, well, who's our intended audience? We knew we had a bit of work to do with our teens. So it gives us an idea of the sorts of areas that we needed to target. And the clinicians, not so much. So interestingly, the clinicians, if they had more accurate knowledge about how effective online therapy was, then they were more likely to want to use it. So we knew we just needed to increase people's knowledge about it. So, you know, these are important things in terms of the later dissemination. So if you've got a tool that, you know people will be more likely to use if they know it works, then you know you need to target your dissemination strategies around that. Ultimately, in the end though, people still preferred face-to-face therapy. So what this tells us is that we need to be really careful in our design. If we know that ultimately people still prefer, for the purposes of therapy, people still prefer face-to-face, we really need to be careful that we don't try and develop a tool that its purpose is to replace face-to-face therapy, because that's not what people want. We need to develop tools for a purpose that they do want a digital tool for. So we need to find the thing that they actually want the digital tool for. So I'm presenting this data to you because I think you need to really match your tool to the purpose. Otherwise, that uptake will never happen. So it's really important to do that. And when you look at, when we ask them, how do you think these computerized CBT should be made available? You can see here, parents and teens want it free on the net. They want it in schools. GPs don't. Mental health workers don't. And they certainly don't want it in GP offices. So you can see there's differences in where they want it. And so therefore there's going to be differences in how they use it. So you really need to target your tool at the purpose. So whilst that's about the child context, what you need to remember is that there's very unique preferences and needs and considerations that really will influence how a tool will be taken up. And if you wait until the very end to assess what they are, then it's too late. And so I would just encourage you to think those things through carefully and really consider them and the strategies for them in every stage, in the design, the development, and the dissemination from the outset. And we didn't, so that's some of the pitfalls of our 20 years. You know, we sort of did some of those things later. So, you know, we've had a lot of changes that we've made over time. And so I can reflect back on that now. So these are the 3 Ds that I think now when I reflect back on everything that we've done, these are the three Ds that I think are really, really important. And the process for developing and sharing these effective digital assessments and instruments. They're not sequential. So I haven't sort of numbered them, and I think they can happen in any order. They can happen simultaneously, and they should happen repeatedly. So, you know, I'm actually going to talk about development first and then come back to design, but I think they should happen repeatedly. So design really needs to be co-design, but it depends on your population. So this can involve a couple of different components: user-centered design process and defining goals and targets. Now this really depends on what you're trying to achieve. So clearly, you know that you need to involve users at every stage. You need to test the engagement and usability. But what's equally important is to think about setting some really clear goals and targets, and to base these in evidence or theory and behaviour change mechanisms. And really make sure you check that you've done that, and that the user group or your experts think you've done that correctly and that it's come through. Because if it hasn't, then they're another user. You know, they're in essence, they're another user. And I think that you need to make sure that you've actually captured that, because it's another design element. And I'll give you some examples of that in a moment. Development and redevelopment. I can't stress strongly enough every opportunity you get to redevelop your tech, every little bit that you can, because otherwise it will be out of date before you know it really. And to continually test your effectiveness of every component as you go, because not only does it let you show that your tool is working, but it lets you track the improvement and refine your tool. And that's what keeps your users coming back. If they can see that you're adapting based on their feedback and adapting whether or not it changes, you know, what you said it was going to change, then it will keep strengthening your tool, and it will keep developing your evidence base. And that's what helps you keep strengthening your tool, your program, helps you keep getting your research money coming in as well. And that also allows you to bring back in the design and the co-design components. And then the dissemination and taking to scale, we'll go through the different approaches that you might be able to use to disseminate, and continually tracking, continually designing, continually redeveloping to keep that going strong. And we'll go through different elements of each of these now. Consulting with those who've done it before. So what we're going to do is go through 3 different examples of some tools to try and highlight each of these now. Now, for the purposes of just highlighting each of these sections, I've just put numbers on them, but again, like I said, it's not sequential, but just to draw back to the user-centered design process. If you see a 1, that's what I'm referring to. If you see a 2, it's the defining the goals and targets. Development, redevelopment 3, and dissemination 4. There's loads of useful resources out there. Some of them in this slide and the next slide do relate to children, but I would encourage you to sort of have a look at various resources that are out there. We had an expert group that I think we had about 25 researchers and from various disciplines that got together for a 3-day workshop where we basically sort of put together all of our expert knowledge around from development, design development through to dissemination as to how we really thought we needed to just develop and disseminate tools relating to child and adolescent anxiety, and that's that top left one there. So, you know, people have come together to really give guides as to how to sort of do these things. And so I'd strongly encourage people to have a look at all of these reviews and frameworks that exist out there with respect to the particular target groups and contexts that you are working in. So we're going to have a look at some development and redevelopment examples within the first first tool that I'm going to talk about, which is Coping Coach. Now, this is one that I had worked on with a group from the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. And this was an NIH-funded project that really relates to children's medical traumas. So children who, for example, have been in one-off traumas like car crashes or fires or things like that. And the reason we looked at this is because acute medical events are really common in childhood. And what happens is people kind of think that, you have an accident or something, it's just a one-off, you'll be fine. But what we actually know is that some kids are fine, but actually some kids have long-term traumatic reactions from that. And because you don't think it's going to have a problem, they don't ask for help. So we know that when we have psychoeducational sort of parent websites, they're really useful, but there's no opportunity for kids to engage in them. And so we sort of had this opportunity where we thought, well, how could we integrate a child website where we could prevent the development of stress and traumatic stress in children? How do we do this online with kids? They can't sit there and read information. That's boring. How about a game? How about a gaming sort of intervention, a prevention sort of game? So that's where we came up with Coping Coach. So what we did here is in the co-design sort of section, we really looked at that second step of number 2, designing our goals. So we really had to think about this carefully. I don't know if anyone has ever done any prevention-based work before. Prevention's really, really hard because you're looking at a tiny, tiny, minute change, and it's really hard to make that change. So you really have to look at the theoretical sort of constructs that you're trying to change. And so we know in this setting that the kids who end up having problems are those who have really, really negative thoughts or cognitive appraisals, who have poor coping strategies, and who have no social support. So we had to look at developing strategies that would improve their cognitive appraisals, improve their coping strategies, and improve their social support. So we identified those targets. We developed intervention content for those. We identified the outcomes. So we had the theory here. So this is the designing part, the psychological designing part. And then we built the concept and the intervention for that. So you can see that this is the design part that isn't necessarily the sitting down with the kids and building it, but it's equally as important. And the idea here was that we would have the conceptual design, build the prototype with few priority modules, and then we would do a pilot test. Now, the difficulty with doing co-design with kids is if you go in and give them an open slather, they will come up with all sorts of random stuff. And that's really, really difficult then to cohesively put into, modules. So in this instance, we actually designed with the graphic designers some high priority modules and then got feedback from the children. Now, keep in mind, this was about 2010. This was when, it might have been even a bit before, Flash was all the rage, okay? So you can see in that bottom right screen, that's all Flash. I think Second Life was all the rage as well. So what the kids were doing, that top right screen, it was all about those 3D characters that would move around the screen. These are the games that kids were playing. So we were building this game that allowed the characters to move around and interact with other characters, which were the games that they were playing at the time. So we built these games where they would walk up to the characters and actually be in a live world where they could then talk to the other characters because that's what they were familiar with. And then Flash games down the bottom, which was a technology that they were using as well. And we had this face builder where they could sort of pull across emotions and things to sort of get them used to the different emotions that they might be experiencing. Build up those modules and then got some feedback from the kids. Kids came back and said, hey, and you can see at the top, we've got number 1 to 3, we've got the kids coming in giving feedback, helping to co-design the next stage. Hey, it looks like it's trustworthy and stuff from an information point of view. It's a bit complicated. Yes, I know we play this game at home. We do this kind of stuff at home. It's really not usable for the type of stuff that we want to use it for. So we don't really want the same stuff that we're doing at home. We want it to be easier. We want it to be interactive. We want more audio. We want less text. We want to be able to track our accomplishments. And we want a story. We want something to tie it all together. So they basically came back and they said, yeah, we want something a bit different. We want a 2D game. We want something a bit retro. We want a bit more engagement, but not in that way that we're used to in our games that we play at home. And they helped us design this new story, this new game with these story levels. And they came up with these tree worlds and these airship worlds and these cloud worlds. And they came up with this coding coach theme with characters, some very basic looking characters. Like, to me, this was, you know, really funny. They choose an avatar. They came up with this squirrel guy who they called General Malay or something, and he had this evil plot. And then they had these 4 character stories for asthma, house fire, car crash, and you know, violence. Very retro style sort of text that they wanted to do. You know, you still had to sort of move around the world, but it was very, very basic. Very, very basic faces that they had to sort of choose from. So they really wanted to kind of make it really easy so that they could still take away the meaning from the actual activity. So the message that they wanted us to hear was, hey, you're overcomplicating things. We can't take away the emotional meaning, or we can't take away the activity that you're trying to get away. So you're distracting us from understanding the emotions and the thoughts and the problem solving activities that you're wanting us to do. So that's really important for us. And it's a message actually that has come through time and time again in our co-design processes. It's also a message that's come through when I've done some work with people in a virtual reality lab. And, you know, it's certainly when I've visited and, you know, they've designed up their virtual reality environments, and I've been in there and I've gone, look, I've noticed your characters are missing their feet, you know, they've got no feet on them. He's like, yeah, they don't need it. You don't need all the fancy things. They just need to sort of see the main part. And if you make the situations too complex, it sort of detracts from all the situations, because you're actually trying to really focus in on the fact that you want to you know, recreate the stress. It was a PTSD setting there as well. You actually need to focus in on the purpose of your setting, and the bells and whistles really detract from that. So again, I'm coming back to this whole notion of think about what your purpose is. So, you know, they really brought us back to some of these things. They wanted simple things like this. They just wanted a workbook that they could type in and just have it there for themselves. The next step is we went and got experts to validate our content. So that's an important step as well, getting those experts to come in and validate what you're doing, as well as the kids. So think about, again, all those multiple stakeholder groups. That's, again, some of that validation and using that to inform the redevelopment. And then did it work? That particular game, it did make the symptoms drop for the high risk group. They engaged with the game, that second version of the game, once we got it right, and they played for 52 minutes, which was really great. Once we got it right. So that was really helpful for us in sort of thinking about, okay, we've really got to listen to the kids here, and we've now integrated those processes into this next tool here. Now, this is the interactive child distress screener, and this is something that Jamin has been involved with quite closely. And it's something that I'm really excited about, actually, and it's really cool. It's one of our projects that our PhD student, Kirsty Zishank, has been working on. And it's effectively something that we've been developing as a replacement for you know, our pen and paper type screening instruments. So when we get our kids to fill in our little forms that say, hey, I feel really worried, or I had trouble sleeping, we think our young kids are not very good at that. And, you know, I know when I've given it to my child, she doesn't understand some of those words. So our argument is, we think that they'd be much better at looking at animations to be able to identify with animations than words. So we've been through a number of stages. This first stage has been the development and refinement of content, which has been that expert sort of stage in coming up with the actual domains and the content and validating those with the expert stakeholders. So this is the user co-design from the expert point of view. I won't go into detail there because that's similar to what we sort of just talked about. And basically we ended up coming up with a set of 15 set of constructs in that one there. So no child involvement there, but the expert development. Then we got the kids involved. So here, we really weren't sure here. And I want you to think about this from a point of view of, you know, if you're thinking about using some of those AR, VR sort of techs now, and you're wanting to trial something really, really new, think carefully about whether you've got enough pilot data to sort of suggest that this could work. Because we really weren't sure, because nobody had ever done this before, whether we could validly get these kids to tell us whether or not they're anxious via an animation, as opposed to asking them a question. So rather than going full steam ahead and just creating a full tool, we wanted to do a proof of concept. Okay, and so we wanted to sort of test that first in a small number of animations. And so we developed up a few animations first, and we got the designer to come up with a few animations, a positive and a negative for an item. So say, for example, happy and sad, we got them to develop up an animation for each. We got them to develop an app, an interface, and I'll show you an example of that in a moment. And then we got children to come and look at those animations and tell us what they thought and tell us if they could understand them. And then have a look and see whether we could actually tap into their emotions with that. I wanted to show you an example. This is the very first animation that the animator came up with for the child emotion of worried. Now I want to show you this one, and then I want to show you later the one that the children helped to design after they looked at this and said, hey, no way. So let's have a look. This is what an animator came up with without the input from the kids. So not particularly expressive, right? So you can see just a little bit of arm sort of rubbing there. And when we asked the kids, hey, what happened here? You know, some of the kids were like, oh, it kind of looks like she has a bit of an itchy arm, maybe. You know, they didn't quite get it. And so, you know, you can see that the mouth is in a little bit of a worried sort of form. So when we actually went through with our test prototype animations, you can see here worried, which is that one that you just saw. The older kids kind of got it. Some of the older kids got it, but none of the younger kids, right down to age 4, 5, and 6, they didn't get it. They didn't get it right. Okay, so that told us straight away they didn't understand that animation. It needed work. Whereas the sad and happy animation, they all got it right, because that's a pretty easy one to animate. So we knew straight away we needed to get them more involved in the design process. But instead of going ahead and developing all those animations, we wanted to get this right first so that we could prove the concept. So we asked them to tell us, how would you do that? Okay, make it more extreme, more exaggerated, add a context, add a setting, more iconic cartoon elements. You know, they wanted thought bubbles, make it look like a zombie, those kind of things. This one I think is a really important example. So when I said before, you know, we just weren't sure if we could use animations. We wanted them to, you know, tell us a time when they might have felt like the character in the animation. And what we actually discovered was, even though they couldn't tell us verbally what that person was feeling, they could tell us another time when they felt like that. And so what that showed to us was that even though, you know, they couldn't tell us the name, they could identify with the emotion. And so what that's starting to show is that the new technologies can start to tap into some of these emotions a little bit better than the child being able to identify. And I think that's what's going to happen with some of your newer emerging technologies, our virtual realities and things like that. You'll be able to start doing some really cool stuff, and you'll be able to add your skin conductance and some of these other cool heart rate monitors and things. And you'll be able to start identifying when people are anxious before they even know they're anxious. And I think that's where we'll start to be able to see some really cool advancements in our health tools. But I really encourage you to test the proof of concept first before you jump full steam ahead into, you know, just assuming you've got it right. Because we could see that we're on the right track, but we knew we had to make some changes. So we took all that information from the kids and we took that back to the animator, and based on all the information that the children gave her, this is what she was able to come up with. So much better, right? Everybody can see that that is worried, and you probably couldn't hear the heartbeat going quite as loud, but that's what the kids gave her. So the animator was then able to come up with something. And so what's really cool about that is that the kids were able to really come up with some excellent designs. Going through it again. And then they helped to come up with the opposite, which was confident. And so that's the confident one. And so what happens in this tool is that children are presented with both of those animations, and they just have to pick which one is more like them. So they go through, they don't have to read any statements, they just have to say, well, which one's more like you? And they just pick one, because the aim of this tool is just to pick up on distress. And so the kids just simply go, yeah, that one's more like me. I'm going to just show you one more and then we'll move on to the next section. If we've got time at the end, I can show you the whole tool. This is an example of sleep problems and not sleep problems. As opposed to so again, they just pick the one that's more like them. And so I know, for example, my own daughter, you know, she did the questionnaire, pen and paper version, and she did this questionnaire as well. And when she did this one, she picked that later one where she sleeps quite well. When she did the questionnaire one, it says, I have trouble sleeping. And she picked the option that said often. And I said, oh, well, you know, why did you pick that option? She goes, oh, well, I wake up a lot. And I said, well, do you? Because I don't think she does. And she said, oh, yeah, I often wake up because I have to go to the toilet. And I'm like, okay. And I said, well, do you go back to sleep straight away? And she goes, yeah, of course. And I'm thinking, well, okay, so she's picked that because she, you know, gets up, goes to the toilet, and then she comes back and she goes straight to sleep. But because she wakes up to go to the toilet, she's picked that option. But here, she's been able to see that she wakes up refreshed and she's okay. So she's identified more closely with that one, and it means more to her. So, you know, for her, that's a much more valid way of assessing her sleep. So our argument with this instrument is it will be much more valid at picking up those things. And I think it's been successful in that respect. So after we had identified that those three first items were so successful and the kids really helped shape that design, then we realized, okay, we're onto something. This type of technology is going to work. So we went fully into designing the entire instrument, but we realized that we needed to change our co-design approach. Okay, so we realized that we needed to get the kids involved in the entire process. So in fact, what we did was we brought 20 children in to design the rest of the animations from the outset. These are actually children involved in the study. They gave us a consent to photograph them and to use their photographs in this format. They came in, they did show and tell focus groups where they acted everything out on all of these emotions. We just started off by asking them to tell us what all these different emotions and behaviors meant. They acted everything out. They told us what it meant. They told us the context. We videoed them. We did everything, a true full co-design sort of nature. And we used all of that information to get a typology of all the different constructs that we were looking at. Then we took all of that and we created all the storyboards with the designer, and the designer put all of that into the animations and came up with the rest of the animations for the instrument. We took that then through an iterative interview process where we got the young children to validate the content material of the animations. And we kept going iteratively until the accuracy was there. So the children came in, we checked that they understood all of the items, the animator kept refining the animations until the accuracy was 100% for all of the items, until children understood all of them. And ultimately ended up with our 15 animations that all the children understood. And so then we ended up with our instrument, which involves all of those various pictures and animations, which I can show you at the end if you're interested, and is currently, has undergone psychometric validation, and that our PhD student is currently finishing the write-up for. And I'm happy to say has come out looking pretty good in its validation compared to those pen and paper instruments. And I think, yeah, will hold up very nicely. And looking at redevelopment now for new population groups and older children, and some of that initial work has indicated that the older children are more interested in this style of animation as opposed to the coloured. They're all more interested in this style. So what we're looking at now for our Million Minds platform is, which is that big grant that Jamie was talking about at the beginning, was integrating the youth, the young people from beginning to end. We've got them involved in advisory groups. We've got them involved in the naming of the platform. We're holding age-specific focus groups from children, adolescents, parents, from the platform look and feel right through from how they want to receive their assessment through to what the characters look like, the heroes, the personas, right through to how they want to receive feedbacks and rewards. So they're involved in every aspect of the design of our new platform as well. I'm going to speed through now a little bit because I know we're sort of coming to our time, and go through dissemination with an example of Brave. Now, Brave is the big program that Jamin was talking about, which we've been developing since 2001, which is our online CBT program for youth anxiety. It has gone through very many stages of development and dissemination. The initial stage started in 2001. We actually built this ourselves personally. I sat there, learned how to use Dreamweaver, and built it actually as we ran the groups live. So we built this as a blended format. So built it to mimic the clinic session. And I think this is why the program has been so successful. So we did one session in the clinic, and then in between that and the next week, I built the session for the young people to use so that it would really mimic the clinic environment. I would then obtain weekly feedback from the participants, integrate it into the next session, and so it's ongoing sort of live development, and we evaluated that as we went. Brace yourselves, this is what it looked like. This is the very, very, very first version. These were all little like spinning icons and you know, all this old school type stuff. The cat was like hissing and animated and stuff, like really old school template style designs. Hideous now when you look at it. But yeah, we built this back in 2001. So kids loved it, absolutely loved it. Quizzes and things. Yeah, version 1.0. Then we went on to redevelop and the full online program. Much more interactivity, lots more animations, sounds and stories. This one then we had full program online, email therapist support. We had a proper web design company who actually built the program for us then. So lots of redevelopment. You can see that redevelopment coming through, continuing to collect data and evaluate its efficacy there, more RCTs. A little bit different here, you can see in the design. So lots of bright colours, click and move sort of games, So the kids really wanted a lot of the stories and the bright colours coming through. The next stage was to extend to new populations. So the timeline's starting to move on here. Lots of redevelopment, refresh of shared code. So every chance we got, we tried to refresh that code. As we went, people were starting to learn now more about this co-design process. So if you can imagine back in 2006, people had never mentioned the word co-design here. Participatory design had not been mentioned, but we were starting to get our heads around this notion that we needed to include young people a bit. So we started to sort of involve them in that process a bit more. Ongoing continued evaluation. So for us, part of the reason that Brave has been so successful is that, you know, we really built with the end in mind. So thinking of how we wanted people to sort of use this and making sure that our young people were consulted with that. You can start to see some of the differences in the way that the age groups were accounted for here. We haven't had enough money over the years to do complete rebuilds of the program. And you know what? It's come back around full circle and people just think it's retro now. So it's sort of, you know, we had maybe a 2-year period where it's like, oh, the graphics are a bit old, we need to redo it. And now it's retro again. So we're okay at the moment. But yeah, very different to the kids' look and feel. And then we were lucky enough to get some support from Beyond Blue to bridge it and to translate and to disseminate into that open access public health sort of level. So here is where we hit that dissemination stage. So you can see now we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, all those numbers at the top. And so it's not just a matter of going straight to dissemination. You've got to do all those things together. And so we had to redevelop the core features. We had to get the co-design processes happening again. We couldn't just take that one program and plant it, make it open access. We had to fully redesign features to make sure that all of our stakeholders were happy. At this point in time, our stakeholders and our users were not just children, not just adolescents. They were Beyond Blue. They were our young people with lived experience. They're our consumers. They're our clinicians. They were everyone. And lots of data testing and ongoing satisfaction testing. So that was the process that we had to follow here, you know, determining what needed to be redesigned, recruiting volunteer young people to be involved in that, developing prototypes, usability, acceptability testing, refinements, and repeating all around. And that process is still ongoing today. So we have not ever stopped that process. I'm going to skip that one, but I want to show you this. If any of you are psychologists, I'm not sure if you are, but if anybody knows anything about anxiety, one of the key techniques is exposure hierarchies. And that basically means that if you have a fear or anxiety about something, you tend to avoid what you're afraid of. And so one of our key techniques is that we slowly expose you to what you're afraid of through an exposure hierarchy. It's our key technique. When you convert your therapy to completely online or completely self-help, you lose your therapist who supports you to do that because it's like really challenging. It's really hard to get somebody to face their fears, right? So if you ask a kid to all of a sudden go on a school camp or sleep over at their friend's house, they'll freak out. So the therapist has been really important in that. And so when we got to the point of doing this in a self-help format, we really needed to think about how to redesign that. So if you see this picture on the left, that was our very first version of our Brave ladder. Oops. And it was, you know, effectively, it's cut off the bottom, but it was effectively a handout where they had the steps and then they had a little table. They just had to write their 10 steps in. Our second version was they had this very, very basic template on the website where they had to write their steps in and their rewards. Then with this new development, I'm going to skip out of this for a second and I'm going to try and share the screen with you. Can you see the Brave program now? Yep. This is the Brave program. And this is something that we built in the new open access version. What I'd really love to do now is integrate some virtual reality into this. But I'm not actually convinced that it will help. And it's one of those things I think I'd really need to sort of do some slow sort of steps. So instead of just giving them that handout or that little thing with that where we say, hey, create 10 steps, gradual steps, pick a goal, sleep over at a friend's house, and sort of work and come up with 10 steps, which is really, really super challenging for a child. We've created this new tool here, which is much more interactive. And so they create a brave ladder, and we've made it really easy for them. And they can come up with their goals. So let's say it's sleep over a friend's house. And then they can add a new step, nice and easy. And we get them to think about, you know, making up small steps. Okay, so they might want to sleep in mum's room as a first step, and they might get to pick their dinner. And then they have to pick their worry level, and they might say, oh, it's about there. And then it comes up saying, hey, that's actually quite worrying for you. Maybe you should have another step before it. So we've made it really interactive for them. And then you say, okay, well, that's a bit worrying, so maybe I should get mum to sleep next to me first. Okay, so I'll get a lolly. I'm just making this up. I wouldn't actually encourage them for that. And then they have that one first, and we'll get them to move that up. So we've made it really easy for them. Then we've said, okay, look, here's some examples. Oh, it's a separation worry. Go to a sleepover, and then they can pick something here. Spend the night at grandma's, and they can just drag it in. So we tried to come up with a way, and we got the kids to help us create this. So we've tried to come up with new techniques, and you can see how this would really lend itself really nicely to be an app, a standalone app that the kids could have on their phone just to create for themselves, and relaxation would be the same. So we had to really think creatively, and we had to get the kids to help us think, you know, when we don't have a therapist involved, how could we overcome this? How could we help the young people to come up with this? And so for me now, I'd really love to sort of take VR and say, okay, let's try and come up with some virtual reality technology here to get them, you know, and develop up some of these scenarios like these ones that I've got on the screen here, where they can set up a sleepover scenario, or, you know, for kids who are really scared about storms, set up some storm scenarios where they can put themselves in a storm, because how often do we get storms that I can expose children to? Not often enough. And so to be able to sort of take that. All right, I'll speed through, Jamin. I'm sorry. Good. So just to sort of take us home in terms of then how to effectively disseminate, really important to identify your consumer. And again, remembering that's not always your user. Thinking about how to stimulate your referrals into the program, and really think about promoting that awareness using a method that's accepted to them, and track your success and referral pathways. So look at who uses your program or your tool, and then use that data to shape your future promotion, because otherwise you could be ending up sort of targeting at people that aren't actually going to use your program. So for example, we're at 49,485 users. I was really hoping we'd crack the 50,000 by the time we got here today, but we're just shy. What that tells me is that there's so many young people who are seeking help, which is sad, but I'm really happy that we're able to have something there that can support them. As you can see here, 32% comes from schools, another 9% from guidance counsellors. So we're getting a lot of our referrals from schools. So we target a lot of our promotion at schools as well, and health professionals, another 13%. So we sort of, you know, have spent a lot of time on those referral pathways. So you find your sources that work. And how to maintain ongoing referrals. I can't stress this enough, the co-design doesn't end. Keep seeking feedback and keep integrating those redevelopments. So 1 and 3, keep testing, keep refining, keep using that co-design process as you go. And just here to show you, yes, it did work. The overall program, you can see these are the reductions over time for people that are using the program. The more sessions they did, the higher the reductions in the program. So for us, we let people know, you know, we put this information out there that if they do the program, it will actually help their anxiety. And so that's really useful for people to know. Even if they only do 3 sessions, they'll see a reduction in their anxiety. And What's really important, something I came back to and I said right at the beginning, find out how your people want to use, how your users want to use the tool that you've created. Because we designed this as a 10-session program that we wanted people to use as a therapy. When we put it out there as an open access program, that's not how people want to use it. And so if we actually look at our adherence rates and if we report on how many sessions people use, they only do about 3 sessions. And so scientifically, when I report this in the literature, it looks really poor, okay? And so it's like, oh, people aren't using the program properly. But actually, when I ask them why they stop using it after 3 sessions, they tell me it's because they've got what they need. That's all they wanted out of the program. And when you look at it, they've got a nice reduction. That's all they're after. And so it's really important for you to match the purpose of the tool with what they're after. And otherwise your data won't tell you what you need either. I'll skip through that one. We've made all these sorts of changes in our program since being live because of what the young people have asked us. That Brave ladder, the user charts, the training guides for our education professionals. By following up on our referrals, we found out that our teachers wanted training guides. So we've helped them do that. We've added a professional back end for our clinicians, and that's everything that's helped stimulate our referral pathways on an ongoing basis. We've added a preschool version of the program. We've kept going and added what people wanted. And, you know, this is what we found out. Our blended version had the highest efficacy, highest engagement, but also the highest therapist time and the lowest reach. Our full online version had really good efficacy, good engagement, very low therapist time and okay reach. Our open access program had good efficacy, but not as good as the rest, lower engagement, very low therapist time, but awesome, awesome reach. So for us now, what we're trying to work out is how we come up with those models in between. Now, we're looking at these models of stepped care to see if they are the answer, where they start off with self-help and then they go on to receiving therapist support if they need it. I'm not going to spend any time on these slides here because I think they're more sort of clinical type questions. We're building these comprehensive and personalised care models, which is that Million Minds platform that we sort of talked about, where we're personalising the treatment that they receive. That might be the answer as well. We're integrating all of our co-design and our research into routine care from the beginning in our Million Minds platform. So none of this RCTs in the research setting anymore. All of it's in the community setting. We'll see how that goes. And then the last thing that we have tried, and you may want to try, is commercialization. Might be a viable pathway. It can be necessary. It might be a way of getting clinicians to take up through licensing, can kickstart trials, but it means a loss of control. And it's something that when we have commercialized Brave before, but it meant that we lost control, and it meant that the people that we commercialized to, you can see the examples there, they tried to redevelop Brave, and these are some of the examples they came up with that I was not at all happy with. You know, particularly the two on the right. To me, I just went, what are you doing? They tried to also build a 3D game that was horrible. Thankfully, this company went bankrupt. And so none of these versions ever went live, which I was really, really, really thankful for. But, you know, these are some of the pitfalls of commercialization, is that sometimes you will lose control. But commercialization can be one of the ways that you might be able to disseminate your product. Getting in from the beginning with a commercialization designer company could be another way as well. So, you know, it may be necessary. So overall, all of those things together, the 3Ds, are particularly important. How you do them and the order that you do them, I don't think should be prescribed. So I think a lot of people will always tell you you totally need to do co-design from the beginning, and you do need to do co-design throughout. But I personally think that you need to be flexible with that approach, and that you shouldn't always feel as though you need to go in with a completely open co-design approach from the beginning. because there are circumstances under which that can get you in trouble. And I think sometimes you need to have parameters around your co-design, particularly with children and young people. But integrating it throughout, and development and redevelopment throughout. And if possible, dissemination from the beginning and keeping it in mind. Now, some of these points you might not like, you might not agree with, and I'm happy to now have some discussion about them. My experience is when we're talking about apps, maybe when we're talking about commercialized products, it is definitely about the best, the brightest, the shiniest, the fanciest products. When we're talking about trying to blend digital tools with health, with mental health, with learning outcomes, fancy can distract. And they can distract from the purpose of the tool. So for me, it's about matching the purpose of the tool with the technology. And it's also not always about what young people want, and it might not be about what adults want as well. So simple might be what's needed, and it's more about the meaning and what they take away from things. I think true co-design will help overcome this, but need to sort of be done with the evidence-based approaches in mind. So I think, you know, that's something that I'm happy to sort of talk about. And for me, that whole process of the last 20 years, for me, my emerging technologies were different emerging technologies to you guys. It was the animations, and it was some of the flash technologies, and, you know, different softwares and things, but the same principles apply. And I think we need to be careful not to jump in too quickly and make sure that we test the proof of concept first. So I'm sorry I've gone over. There's so much to talk about. And I'm really happy to talk and answer questions. Thank you for listening for so long.